Before we get started, I just want to say that what I'm about to tell you isn't a story I'm proud of. It's a story about a line I had to cross, a line I never thought would be drawn through the middle of my own living room. It's about what happens when the two halves of your life, the ones you keep so carefully separated, collide. Most people see me as just another suburban dad. I coach Little League. I struggle with the assembly instructions for flat pack furniture, and I argue with my son about screen time. They see my sensible sedan, my manicured lawn, and my contributions to the neighborhood bake sale. They see Arthur, the guy who works a boring desk job for the government. They don't see the other half. They don't see the secure rooms, the encrypted briefings, the constant low-grade hum of professional paranoia that's been drilled into me for 15 years at the State Department. My life is a carefully constructed wall, with my family on one side and my work on the other, and I was the guy standing guard on top of it, making sure nothing ever crossed over. But I failed. The enemy didn't come over the wall, he was invited in for tea, and that's a mistake that almost cost me everything. So if you're ready, grab a drink, settle in, because this is the story of how I had to become a monster to protect my family from a wolf in sheep's clothing. My wife, Sarah, is a good person. She's kind, she's trusting, and she sees the best in people. It's one of the things I love about her. It's also her greatest vulnerability. For months, she'd been worried about our son, Asher. He's a great kid, smart and funny, but history class was his Waterloo. He just couldn't connect with it. His grades were slipping, and with high school just around the corner, Sarah was panicking. So she did what any loving, proactive mother would do. She decided to hire a tutor. That right there was the beginning of the end. She found him through an online service that catered to affluent families in our area. His name was Miles. His profile was impeccable. A history degree from Oxford, glowing testimonials, a photograph that radiated a kind of disarming academic charm. He was an Englishman in America, bringing a bit of old-world intellectual rigor to the new world. Sarah was instantly smitten with the idea of him. When I first met Miles, I had to admit, he was impressive. He had a firm handshake, looked you right in the eye, and spoke with a quiet confidence that was reassuring. He was tall and lean, dressed in that effortlessly smart way that seems unique to certain British men, a tweed jacket that looked both ancient and expensive, worn-out leather brogues, and a genuine warmth in his smile. He listened more than he talked, asking thoughtful questions about Asher's interests, his learning style, his passions. He wasn't just a tutor, he was a mentor, a guide, or so he seemed. Within 2 weeks it was like a miracle had occurred. Asher, who used to groan at the mere mention of homework, was suddenly excited about his sessions with Miles. They weren't just reading from a textbook, they were discussing strategy, motivation, the hidden currents of power that shaped events. Miles was making history come alive. Sarah was over the moon. "I told you, Arthur," she'd say, beaming at me over dinner. "He's a godsend. It was worth every penny." And I agreed. I wanted to agree, but there was a small cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. It was the same feeling I got in a briefing when a source's story was just a little too clean, a little too perfect. Miles was wonderfully effective. Too effective. It was the little things. A casual question he asked me one evening about the traffic patterns around the federal building downtown. A comment he made about a specific type of encryption used in commercial satellites that seemed oddly specific for a history tutor. I'd brush it off. I had to. This was my home. The wall. "You don't bring the office home, Arthur," I'd tell myself. "You're being paranoid. This is what Sarah wanted, what Asher needed. Don't ruin it with your spook think." The breaking point, the moment the wall came crashing down, happened on a Tuesday night. It was late, close to midnight. I was heading up to bed and walked past Asher's room. His door was ajar, his reading light still on. He'd fallen asleep over his textbook, something that had never happened before. Miles came along. I smiled, feeling a pang of fatherly pride. My son was finally engaged. I went in to turn off the light and pull his blanket over him, and that's when I saw it. the textbook. It was a standard high school edition, a people's history of the modern world, but it wasn't open to the chapter on the Industrial Revolution they were supposed to be studying. It was open to a special supplementary section at the back, one I didn't even know existed. The title of the section was The Shadow War, Espionage, from 1945 to 1989. My blood didn't just run cold, it felt like it turned to ice. My eyes scanned the page. Passages were highlighted in a neat, precise yellow. My gaze fell on the specific terms: asterisk, dead drop, asterisk, brush, pass, asterisk, signal site, concealment device. These weren't history terms, they were tradecraft. My tradecraft. Then I saw it on the corner of his desk chair, a new backpack. It wasn't a flashy brand a teenager would want. It was a dull gray utilitarian with a specific reinforced bottom and a series of hidden pockets. It was a model I had seen in a classified equipment catalog, favored by certain foreign intelligence services for its innocuous appearance and its utility in carrying sensitive items. I stood there, frozen in the dim light of my son's bedroom, the quiet hum of the house suddenly sounding like a roar in my ears. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a physical blow. Miles wasn't a tutor. He was an operative, and he wasn't teaching my son history. He was training him. He was turning my 13-year-old son into an unwitting asset, a courier who could move through the world completely unnoticed, protected by his own innocence. My son was being weaponized right under my roof, and I, the protector, the man on the wall, had welcomed the enemy in and paid him for the privilege. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was a profound, world-altering cold. It was the same feeling you get moments before a car crash, when you see the headlights coming, and you know with absolute certainty that there's nothing you can do to stop the impact. My entire existence was built on a foundation of control, of risk assessment, of seeing the patterns others missed. And this man, this charming, smiling viper, had slithered into the one place I considered a sanctuary and turned it into an operational theater. I stood in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs, my mind racing through a dozen different protocols. Call my section chief. No. The moment I brought the department into this, Asher would cease to be my son and would become a compromised civilian. He'd be interviewed, debriefed, and forever marked by a file in a basement vault. I'd lose control of the situation instantly. Confront Miles? An even worse idea. He was a professional. He would deny everything, paint me as an unhinged, paranoid father and vanish. But he wouldn't leave empty-handed. He'd take with him the knowledge that I was onto him, that a State Department employee was living in this house. He'd know my identity, and that would put a target on my back, and by extension on Sarah and Asher's for the rest of our lives. The third option, the one that made my stomach churn, was to do nothing, to wait, to watch, to gather proof, to treat my own home as a hostile environment and my own son as a person of interest. It was unthinkable. It was the only choice I had. The next morning, the world felt tilted on its axis. The familiar routine of breakfast was a surreal performance. Sarah was buzzing, talking about a dinner party she wanted to throw. Asher was quiet, but in that engaged, thoughtful way he'd adopted since Miles started. He looked up at me over his cereal bowl. "Hey, Dad," he said. Miles was telling me about the American Revolution. He said the Sons of Liberty were basically like a secret spy ring. Is that true? I felt a jolt, like a low-voltage current running up my spine. I forced a smile. "Something like that, buddy," I managed to say, my voice sounding tight and strange to my own ears. They had to be clever to win. Asher nodded, his eyes bright with interest. "Yeah, that's what Miles says. He says sometimes the most important battles are the ones nobody ever sees." Sarah laughed, ruffling his hair. "See, Arthur, what did I tell you? He's making him think. It's wonderful." I looked at her smiling, unsuspecting face, and I felt a chasm open between us. She wasn't just my wife. She was an obstacle to protecting our son. The thought was so ugly, so deeply disloyal, that I had to look away. That's when the flashbacks started hitting me, my own memory turning into an interrogation room. I remembered every little dismissal, every time I'd voiced a vague unease about Miles and been shot down. It had started subtly. About a month ago I'd come home to find Miles and Sarah chatting in the kitchen. I'd mentioned my day was rough, a lot of bureaucratic nonsense. Miles had given me a sympathetic look and said, "I can only imagine. The logistics of coordinating with overseas consulates must be a nightmare. All those time zones, the secure communication channels, it must take a particular kind of mind to keep it all straight." At the time, I'd been flattered by his insight. Now, I replayed the words and they sounded like probing, like an attempt to gauge the specifics of my job. I'd given him a non-committal answer and changed the subject. A week later, Sarah and I were having a small disagreement. I was worried about Asher spending so much time on his computer. Sarah had defended him, saying, "He's researching for his history project with Miles." Honestly, Arthur, you've got to stop seeing threats around every corner. Not everyone is plotting something. This is Maple Creek, not Moscow. The words stung, not just because they were dismissive, but because she was using my profession as a way to undermine my parental concern. She was painting my instincts, the very skills that paid our mortgage, as a character flaw. The worst one, the memory that truly twisted the knife, was from just last week. Asher had a major project due. He was stressed, and I was trying to help him organize his notes. It was a clumsy effort. I'm not a teacher. Miles arrived for his session, and within minutes he had calmed Asher down, sketched out a new outline, and had him laughing. He was a natural. As I left the room, I overheard Sarah talking to Miles in the hallway. Her voice was low and confidential. "Thank you so much, Miles. Arthur tries, but, well, he lives in such a serious, cynical world. I worry it rubs off. It's so good for Asher to have a male role model who is so positive and, normal." Normal. I stood on the other side of the door, unseen, and that word hit me like a physical blow. In my own home, I was the oddity. I was the dark cloud. Miles was the normal one. He had not only infiltrated my family, he had usurped my role in it. He had become the good father, and I was just the suspicious, paranoid spook who paid the bills. It wasn't just a professional failure anymore, it was a deeply personal one. The lines between my duty to my country and my duty to my family were blurring into a terrifying, indistinct smudge. For days I existed in a state of suspended animation. I went to work, I sat in meetings, I smiled at my neighbors, but inside I was a coiled spring. I was watching everything, analyzing every word. I started coming home early, making excuses to be around during Asher's tutoring sessions. I'd linger in the kitchen, pretending to make coffee, just to overhear snippets of their conversation. It was chillingly brilliant. Miles never said anything overtly treasonous. He'd talk about the French resistance, framing their acts of sabotage as asymmetrical responses to an occupying force. He'd discuss the use of codes and ciphers by the Navajo code talkers, calling it the ultimate secure network. He was planting concepts, building a framework in my son's mind, making espionage sound like a heroic intellectual puzzle. He was normalizing the abnormal, just as he had done with my own wife. The catalyst, the moment the coiled spring finally snapped, came on a Friday afternoon. I was in my home office trying to concentrate on a dry policy brief when Asher came in. He was buzzing with an almost nervous energy. "Hey, Dad. Miles and I are doing a special project tomorrow." "Oh yeah? What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "It's for extra credit. We're doing a presentation on the local history of the Cold War. Miles found this super rare book at the university library, but he can't check it out because he doesn't have a faculty card. So he had it transferred to the public library for me to pick up." My entire body went on high alert. The downtown library? "Yeah, the one next to Centennial Park. It's supposed to be waiting for me." He paused, then added the line that stopped my heart. "And Miles said, If the special collections librarian isn't at her desk when I get there, I should just take a walk through the park for 15 minutes and leave the book I'm returning for him on the third bench from the fountain, the one with the broken armrest. He said he'd be walking his dog there later and could pick it up himself to save me the trouble. A dry run. It was a classic textbook dry run for a dead drop. The specific location, the contingency plan, the time delay, it was all there. He was testing my son's ability to follow a precise, unusual set of instructions without asking questions. The book he was returning for Miles was sitting on his desk. It was a thick, heavy copy of Moby Dick. It felt wrong in my hands, too heavy, too solid. This was it, the point of no return. My son was being sent on his first mission, and he didn't even know it. The coldness I'd been feeling for days was suddenly burned away by a surge of pure white-hot fury. It was a rage so intense, it felt clarifying. The time for observation was over. The time for watching and waiting was done. The rules of my quiet suburban life no longer applied. This man had targeted my child. He had turned my home into his forward operating base. He had manipulated my wife and was in the process of corrupting my son. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about payback. That's what I told myself anyway. But deep down, a colder, harder part of me knew that wasn't entirely true. It wasn't about revenge until it was. He had made this personal. He had crossed a line into my world, and now I was going to cross a line into his, and I was going to burn it to the ground. The first call I made wasn't to anyone at the department, it was to a ghost. A man named David, who had been my first partner in the field, long before I took the desk job. We'd been in some tight spots together, the kind of situations that forge a bond stronger than friendship. He'd left the service a few years ago and now ran a very discreet, very expensive private security firm in the city. His clients were corporations with sensitive problems, and David was the man who made those problems disappear. I called his private number. He picked up on the second ring. "Arthur," he said, his voice calm and familiar. "It's been a while. Everything okay?" "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Nothing is okay. I need your help, David." Off the books. Completely dark. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him shifting from old friends to professional operators. "Tell me," was all he said. I laid it all out for him, the tutor, the textbook, the backpack, the library book. I expected him to be skeptical, to tell me I was letting my job get to my head. Instead, he was quiet, listening intently. When I finished, he let out a long, low whistle. "Damn, Arthur, you really stepped in it. Tell me I'm crazy, David. Tell me I'm overreacting." "I can't do that," he said, his voice grim, "because you're not. This stinks. It has all the hallmarks of a deep-cover grooming op. The target is perfect. The son of a state employee, it's a gold mine. They're not just training him to be a courier. They're cultivating a future source. A generational asset." The words sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. David continued, "First things first, we need to know who this Miles character really is. Give me his full name, date of birth, anything you have. I'll run it through my own systems, see what shakes loose." I gave him the information from the tutoring agency's website. "And Arthur," David added, his voice hardening, "you cannot confront him. You can't pull Asher out. You can't even let your wife know something is wrong. Right now, your ignorance is your family's best protection. You are a clueless, slightly paranoid suburban dad. That is your cover. You will play that role until I tell you otherwise. Understood?" "Understood," I said, the word feeling like ash in my mouth, playing a role in my own home, lying to my own wife. It was a bitter pill to swallow. David called me back 2 hours later. "I've got nothing," he said, and the cheerfulness in his voice was gone. "The name Miles Covington has zero digital footprint before 2 years ago. No university records from Oxford under that name. No birth certificate, no driver's license, nothing. The references on the tutoring site are fakes. The phone numbers lead to burner phones that are now disconnected. The photo is a stock image that's been subtly altered with AI. Your man doesn't exist. He's a legend, a carefully constructed identity. My heart sank. A ghost. It was worse than I thought. So what do we do? I asked. We get eyes and ears, David said, his voice all business now. I have some gear I can lend you. Top of the line, non-attributable. A listening device disguised as a universal phone charger, small enough you can plug it into the wall in Asher's room and it'll go unnoticed. It has a voice activation feature and broadcasts to a secure receiver. I've also got a micro camera, looks like a shirt button. Keep it on you when the tutor is around. We need to get him on tape. We need to know what his specific objective is. The next evening, David met me in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner 10 miles from my house. He handed me a small, unassuming cardboard box. Inside was the gear. It felt alien in my hands. This was the part of my life I had left behind. Be careful, Arthur, he said, his eyes serious. You're the man on the inside now. The risk is all yours. That night, after Sarah and Asher were asleep, I felt like a burglar in my own home. I crept into Asher's room, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The room was filled with the quiet, even breathing of my sleeping son. I looked at his face, so innocent and peaceful, and my resolve hardened into something sharp and dangerous. I unplugged his existing phone charger and plugged in the one David had given me. It looked completely identical. A tiny pinprick of a blue light glowed for a second, then faded. It was active. The bug was planted. The next tutoring session was 2 days later. I sat in my office, the receiver in my hand, a pair of headphones clamped over my ears. I felt sick. I was eavesdropping on my own son. The session started innocuously enough. They were talking about the rise of Napoleon. But then the conversation took a turn. I listened, my knuckles white, as I gripped the receiver, as Miles masterfully wove his poison into the lesson. You see, Asher, Miles said, his voice smooth and persuasive. Napoleon wasn't just a general. He was a master of information. He had spies everywhere. He understood that knowledge wasn't just power, it was the ultimate weapon. He would use ordinary people, bakers, merchants, stable boys, to carry messages for him. People no one would ever suspect. Because the best secret is the one hidden in plain sight. My blood ran cold. He was talking about Asher. He was priming him, flattering him, making him feel like he was part of something clever and important. Then came the moment that changed everything. The leverage. Asher mentioned a classmate who got in trouble for trying to hack the school's computer system. Miles chuckled. Ah yes, brute force. It's so clumsy. The real art is getting the information without anyone knowing you were there. It's about social engineering. Trust. For instance, my supervisor, the man who directs my research, we never meet in person. It's too risky. We have a system. He calls himself Argus, after the giant from Greek mythology with 100 eyes. He sees everything. Miles paused, and I could practically hear the conspiratorial smile in his voice. He has a particular fondness for the Oak Room at the Grand Hotel downtown. He says the coffee is terrible, but the acoustics are perfect for a quiet conversation. He'll be there this Thursday at 3 o'clock, enjoying his terrible coffee. My breath caught in my throat. A name, a place, a time. It was a stupid, arrogant mistake. A moment of hubris from a man who thought he was talking to a child. He had no idea a desperate father was on the other end of the line recording every single treacherous word. He had just handed me the key. The plan in my head began to shift. It was no longer just about exposing Miles. It was about dismantling his entire network. And I was going to use his own methods against him. I was going to use a secret hidden in plain sight. I was going to use a copy of Moby Dick. The night before Asher's library trip, I put my plan into motion. The house was dark and silent. I went into Asher's room and carefully lifted the heavy copy of Moby Dick from his desk. In the sterile light of my garage workshop, I became a different person. The suburban dad vanished, replaced by the man I used to be, the one who was trained in the subtle arts of deception and counterintelligence. I had a small toolkit for electronics repair, and I used it with a surgeon's precision. I carefully steamed the binding of the book, just enough to loosen the glue on the end paper. Just as I suspected, the cardboard beneath was expertly hollowed out. It was a professional job, a perfect little compartment. Tucked inside was a tiny black micro SD card. My heart was a drum against my ribs. This was it, the payload. I used a pair of tweezers to lift it out. I slid it into a reader attached to my laptop. The card was password protected and heavily encrypted, of course. Cracking it would take time, resources I didn't have at the moment, but I didn't need to crack it. I just needed to own it. I used a specialized piece of software to make a perfect bit-for-bit clone of the encrypted data. Then I took a blank micro SD card, a dummy, and used another program to intentionally corrupt its file structure. To any system, it would look like a card that had suffered a catastrophic failure, a dead end. I placed the corrupted dummy card back into the book's hidden compartment, but I wasn't done. I had one more piece of my own to add to the puzzle. David had given me a few other toys. One of them was a low-power RFID tracker, no bigger than a grain of rice. It was passive, meaning it only activated when it came into contact with a reader, but it had a unique signature that could be picked up from a surprising distance. I carefully worked a tiny slit in the book's thick spine and inserted the tracker, sealing it with a single drop of superglue. It was invisible. Perfect. I re-glued the end paper, placed the book under a heavy weight for an hour to set, and then returned it to Asher's desk. It looked exactly as it had before, an innocent classic novel, but now it was my Trojan horse. The next day was Saturday. The air in our house was thick with a tension only I could feel. Sarah was making pancakes, humming along to the radio. Asher was excited, getting his backpack ready for his trip downtown. I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost buckled my knees. I was sending my son into a situation he didn't understand, using him as bait. But the alternative, letting him walk into it blind, was infinitely worse. I was his shield, even if he didn't know it. I told Sarah I needed to run some errands downtown. She just nodded, distracted. Okay, honey, don't be late for dinner. I'm trying that new brisket recipe. Brisket. The sheer banal normality of it was staggering. I was in position 40 minutes before Asher was due to arrive. I was parked 2 blocks away from the library, in a van I'd rented for cash that morning. David was in a separate car a block further down, monitoring communications and acting as my overwatch. I had a pair of powerful binoculars and a direct line of sight to the park entrance and the fountain. It was a crisp autumn day. The park was dotted with people walking dogs, couples on benches, a few kids throwing a frisbee. It was a perfect slice of Americana, and it was about to become a clandestine battlefield. Asher arrived right on time, walking with that slightly self-conscious swagger of a 13-year-old trying to look casual. I watched his every move, my stomach in a knot. He went into the library. He was inside for exactly 7 minutes. He came out, looking a little confused. The contingency plan was in motion. The librarian must not have been at her desk. He walked into the park, heading for the fountain. My eyes were glued to the binoculars. He found the bench, the third one, with the broken armrest. He sat for a moment, looked around, then slipped the copy of Moby Dick from his backpack and placed it on the bench next to him. He got up and walked away, heading back in the direction of the bus stop. He never looked back. He followed his instructions perfectly. My son, the perfect unwitting asset. I felt a surge of pride mixed with a profound sense of sorrow. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. The book just sat there. Then, I saw her, a woman, maybe in her 50s, wearing a drab trench coat and a nondescript headscarf. She walked with a slight limp. She sat on the far end of the bench, opened a newspaper, and pretended to read. After a few minutes, She folded the paper, casually picked up the book as if it were her own, and walked away, heading north. At the same time, from the other side of the park, I saw Miles. He was standing by a hot dog stand, phone to his ear, watching the whole thing. As the woman disappeared around a corner, he hung up his phone. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could imagine the satisfied smile. The drop was complete. The asset had performed flawlessly. I waited until Asher was safely on the bus home before I started my own part of the operation. David's voice crackled in my earpiece. The package is on the move. Female, 50s, trench coat, heading north on Elm Street. I'm tracking. Stay with her, I said. I want to know where that book ends up. But the real show was about to begin. The seeds of panic I had planted were about to sprout. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the listening device in Asher's room. It was voice-activated, and it had just been triggered. I pulled over to a quiet side street and put in my earpiece. It was Miles. He had called Asher's phone. Hey Asher, Miles here. Just wanted to see how the library trip went. His voice was light, but I could detect a new tightness in it, a strained edge that hadn't been there before. Oh hey Miles, Asher said. It was fine. The librarian wasn't there, so I just left the book on the bench like you said. Great, great, perfect, Miles said. A little too quickly. Hey, quick question. Did anyone talk to you in the park? Anyone at all? No, Asher said, sounding confused. Why? No reason, just curious. And you didn't happen to open the book or anything, did you? Just checking. No, it's Moby Dick, Asher said with a laugh. It's like 1,000 pages long. Why would I open it? Right, of course, Miles said. Okay, well, great job today, Asher. You were a big help. I'll see you on Tuesday. He hung up. The call was all wrong. He was checking his asset, trying to see if the operation had been compromised at the source. He was already worried. The best part came an hour after that. My earpiece crackled again. This time the bug was picking up a direct conversation in Asher's room. Miles must have come over to the house under some pretense. I heard his voice, but it was different. It was a furious, controlled whisper. He was on a burner phone. The card is dead, he hissed. It's not just wiped. The file allocation table is completely corrupted. It's a professional job. I don't know what happened. The asset is clean. I spoke to him. He saw nothing, did nothing out of the ordinary. No, I am not compromised. Something went wrong at the handoff. Or we have a mole. He was silent for a moment, listening to the person on the other end. I don't know, he said, his voice ragged with stress. Maybe it was just a hardware failure. A fluke. Yes, I understand the timeline. I know what's at stake. He hung up. I sat there in the driver's seat of the rented van, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. The panic was setting in. They had a blown drop, a corrupted piece of intelligence, and no idea how it happened. Their first assumption wasn't that they'd been targeted from the outside. Their first assumption was that they had a traitor in their own ranks. I had turned their paranoia, their own tradecraft against them. The silent takeover of my home was over. The silent takeover of their operation had just begun. The next 48 hours were the most stressful of my life. I was living a double life in the most literal sense. By day I was Arthur, the concerned father, the slightly distant husband. I helped with homework, took out the recycling, and discussed the merits of various brisket cooking methods with Sarah. But by night, I was a man possessed. I sat in my darkened office, sifting through the encrypted data from the real micro SD card. My decryption software, a relic from my old life that I'd kept on an isolated hard drive, was working slowly, chugging through the layers of code. It was like watching a glacier move, but tiny fragments of text were beginning to emerge. Shipping manifests, bank transaction codes, a list of names not real names, but code names. My hands were shaking. This was bigger than a single agent. This was a logistics network for a foreign intelligence service, operating right under our noses, and my son was their new delivery boy. The pressure was immense. Sarah could feel it. She kept looking at me with a worried frown. "What is going on with you, Arthur?" she asked one night as we were getting ready for bed. "You're a million miles away. You're jumpy. You're not sleeping. Is everything okay at work?" I had to lie. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. "It's just a big project, honey," I said, avoiding her eyes. "A lot of pressure from the higher-ups. It's got me on edge." It was a flimsy excuse, but it was the only one I had. What I needed was time. I needed space to maneuver, to set the final pieces of my plan in place. And most importantly, I needed to get Asher away from Miles. I couldn't risk another extra credit project. I had to engineer a family exodus. The next morning, I came downstairs with a look of weary resignation on my face. I'd practiced it in the mirror. "Bad news," I announced over breakfast. "My department is making us do one of those horrible mandatory team-building retreats. It's for a whole week, up at a cabin resort in the mountains." Sarah groaned. "Oh, Arthur, no. That sounds awful." "I know," I said, putting just the right amount of misery into my voice. "They're trying to make it more family-friendly. They've offered cabins to employees who want to bring their families along, all expenses paid." I paused, then delivered the hook. "I know it's a pain, but maybe it would be good for us. Get away from everything for a few days. No school, no work, just us." I looked at Asher, whose eyes had lit up at the word cabin. Sarah looked at my face, at the stress lines I was no longer trying to hide. Her expression softened. "You know what?" she said slowly. "Maybe you're right. A week in the mountains sounds kind of nice, actually. Yes, let's do it." It worked. It was a lie built on a foundation of truth. My stress was real, even if the cause was a fiction. We were leaving. I had my clear field of battle. The moment the plan was set, I sent a quick, coded text to David: "Fishing trip. 1 week, he'd understand." Then I had Asher call Miles to cancel his sessions for the next week. I listened to the call on my earpiece. Asher explained we were going away on a last-minute family trip. There was a pause on Miles's end. Then his voice, smooth as silk but with an undercurrent I could now easily detect. "Oh, how wonderful. A family getaway. Where are you headed?" "The mountains, I think," Asher said. "A cabin resort." "Lovely," Miles said. "Well, you have a fantastic time, and send me a picture of the snow." It was a seemingly innocent conversation, but I knew better. It was an interrogation. He was trying to pinpoint our location. Later that day, Miles called Sarah. I was in the other room, but I could hear her side of the conversation. "Oh, Miles, that's so thoughtful of you to call." "Yes, a bit sudden, but Arthur has this work retreat." "No, I'm not sure of the exact name of the place. Arthur handled all the booking." Her voice was filled with the warm, trusting tone she always used with him. After she hung up, she came to me, looking puzzled. "That was Miles," she said. "He was just calling to wish us a good trip. He seemed so concerned. He even asked if you were feeling all right, said you seemed stressed lately." I clenched my jaw. He was a master manipulator. He was using his position as the concerned tutor to pump my wife for information. His professional composure was starting to fray at the edges. An operative who can't make contact with his asset is a desperate operative, and a desperate operative makes mistakes. I looked at Sarah's trusting, innocent face. "He's just a very caring person, honey," I said, the words tasting like poison. The power had already begun to shift. He thought he was hunting me. He had no idea I was the one setting the trap. The week at the cabin was one of the strangest of my life. On the surface, it was idyllic. We hiked, we built fires, we played board games. I watched Asher laugh, truly laugh, for the first time in what felt like months. I saw the worry fade from Sarah's eyes. This was the family I was fighting for. This was the peace I was trying to protect. But beneath the surface, I was a man at war. Every night, after they were asleep, I'd be on my encrypted laptop, my face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. The files on the micro SD card were slowly surrendering their secrets. It was a full-blown logistics and financial network, funneling money and equipment to operatives across the East Coast. And at the center of it all was a series of transactions linked to a single holding company. A company whose records David, with his particular set of skills, was able to access. The holding company was a front, of course, but it had a signatory, a name, not Argus. A real name, a man named Petrov. And through that we found him. We knew who Argus was. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on our last day at the cabin. My phone, which had been silent all week, suddenly buzzed with a message from David. It was just a single sentence. He made a mistake. Miles, unable to get information from my family, had reached out to one of his own contacts to try and locate me. It was a sloppy, panicked move, and David, who had been monitoring the chatter around Miles's known associates, had picked it up. Miles had confirmed the time and place of his meeting with Argus. Thursday, 3 o'clock, the Oak Room at the Grand Hotel. He was going to have to explain, in person, how he'd lost a valuable intelligence package. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The trap was ready to be sprung. When we got back home, the house felt different. The air was clear. The enemy was no longer inside the walls. He was out there, exposed and floundering. It was time for the final confrontation, but it wouldn't be a confrontation of force. It would be a confrontation of knowledge. I was going to dismantle his world, not with a weapon, but with a few quiet words. I laid the groundwork carefully. First, I composed an anonymous email. It was short, cryptic, and sent from a public library computer several towns over. It went to a man I knew, a liaison officer at the Russian embassy. We weren't friends, but we had a professional understanding, a mutual respect born of years of circling each other at diplomatic functions. My email simply said, Grand Hotel, Oak Room, Thursday, 15 o'clock. Your man Petrov is meeting a CIA asset. You might want to watch. I wasn't sure Petrov was meeting a CIA asset. In fact, I was sure he wasn't, but it didn't matter. The accusation was enough. It would sow chaos and paranoia. It would ensure that Argus's own people were watching him, that his world was about to be turned upside down by his own side. He would be tainted, burned, regardless of what I did. Next, I called Miles. My voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a concerned father. Miles, I said, it's Arthur, Asher's dad. I was hoping we could meet. I'd like to discuss Asher's progress and your plans for him going forward. There was a slight hesitation on his end. Of course, Arthur. When and where? How about the Grand Hotel? I said, keeping my tone casual. I have a meeting downtown on Thursday. We could grab a coffee in the Oak Room, say, 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock. 1 hour before his meeting with his doom. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear the gears turning in his head, the calculations, the panic. For me to suggest that specific place, at that specific time, was impossible. It couldn't be a coincidence. But what was the alternative? That the clueless suburban dad knew? He had to know. He had to see me. 2 o'clock is perfect, he said finally, his voice a tight, strained imitation of his usual charm. I'll see you then. I walked into the Oak Room at 2 o'clock on the dot. It was an old place, all dark wood, worn leather, and hushed tones. Miles was already there, sitting at a small table in the corner. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and the hand wrapped around his coffee cup had a slight tremor. The charming, confident Oxford academic was gone. In his place was a cornered, terrified man. I sat down opposite him. The waiter came over, but I waved him away. I won't be staying long, I said, my eyes locked on Miles. I just have a few things I want to clear up. I started calmly. Asher has really been enjoying your lessons, Miles. He finds them fascinating. especially your discussions of the Culper ring during the revolution. Miles just stared at me, his face a mask of confusion and fear. He's particularly taken with the concepts you've taught him, I continued, my voice low and even. Dead drops, signal sites. He was so inspired he even tried to design his own concealment device. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick. I slid it across the table. It landed with a soft thud between our coffee cups. The color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. He's a clever boy, I said softly. But he's still a boy, and you put him in danger. You used his innocence. You used my home. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely undone. The original data on the micro SD card you were trying to pass was quite interesting, I went on, leaning in slightly. My associates and I are still going through it. The financial records for Petrov's little holding company are particularly illuminating. At the mention of the name Petrov, a flicker of genuine terror crossed his eyes. He knew that I knew everything. But that's not your biggest problem right now, is it, Miles? Or whatever your real name is. I glanced at my watch. Your real problem is that your supervisor Argus is due to walk through that door in exactly 47 minutes. And my guess is, he's not going to be in a very good mood when he has to explain to his superiors why his drop was blown and his entire network is compromised. I leaned back in my chair, and then there's the other problem. The two gentlemen sitting in the black sedan across the street, the ones from the SVR's local station. I'm not sure what they'll do when they see a known intelligence officer like Petrov meeting with a man they've just been told is a CIA asset. It's going to be a very messy, very complicated afternoon. I stood up, my own coffee untouched. You endangered my son. You violated my home. You underestimated me. This is where it ends. I suggest you walk out of that door right now and you don't look back. Disappear. Because if you are ever in this city again, if you ever try to contact my family again, the next conversation we have will be much less pleasant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet finality in my words was more powerful than any threat. He just sat there, staring at the book on the table. A man whose entire world had just been systematically dismantled by a suburban dad in a slightly rumpled suit. I turned and walked out of the hotel, and I didn't look back. I didn't need to. In my earpiece, I heard David's voice, calm and clear. He's moving. He's heading for the back exit. He's running. It was over. I never saw Miles again. He vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. There were no news reports, no arrests, no international incidents. Just a quiet, sudden collapse of a foreign intelligence network in my little corner of the world. The ripple effects were invisible to everyone but me. The real victory wasn't in a hotel bar, it was in my own living room. A few nights later, the house was quiet. Asher was upstairs, actually reading a history book for pleasure. I sat down with Sarah on the sofa. This was the hardest part, the final debrief. I couldn't tell her everything. I couldn't tell her about Petrov or the SVR or the micro SD card. It would have terrified her, and it would have broken the fragile peace I had fought so hard to restore. But I had to tell her the truth that mattered. Sarah, I began, my voice steady. We need to talk about Miles. She looked at me, a question in her eyes. I told her a version of the truth that she could understand. That Miles wasn't who he said he was. That he was a dangerous, manipulative man who had been flagged by my department for trying to get close to government employees. That he was grooming Asher, not for a history bee, but for something far more sinister. That the strange behavior, the stress, the sudden trip, it was all me trying to handle the situation without scaring her. I watched her face as I spoke. I saw confusion, then denial, then a dawning, sickening horror. No, she whispered. He was so kind, he was so good with Asher. He was an actor, Sarah, I said gently, and he gave the performance of his life. He saw your trust and he exploited it. Then I said the words that had been sitting on my chest like a stone for weeks. I tried to warn you. I told you I had a bad feeling about him. My instincts were screaming at me. I asked you to trust me, just this once, to trust the part of my life that you don't see, and you didn't. You told me I was paranoid. The words hung in the air between us. She didn't get angry. She didn't get defensive. Her face crumpled, and she started to cry. Quiet, racking sobs of guilt and fear, and a terrible belated understanding. "Oh God, Arthur," she wept. "You were right. You were right, and I called you crazy." I pulled her into my arms, and she held on to me like she was drowning. It was a painful, ugly moment, but it was also the most honest moment we had shared in years. It was the moment the wall between my two lives finally came down, not with a crash, but with a quiet, mutual understanding. The foundation of our marriage was cracked, but it wasn't broken. We could rebuild. We had to. My family was safe. My son was safe. That was the only victory that mattered. And you know, looking back on it all now, the whole thing seems like a crazy fever dream. But it taught me something. It taught me that we build these quiet lives for ourselves, in these quiet neighborhoods, and we think we're safe. We build fences and install alarm systems, thinking the dangers are all on the outside. But the real threats, the ones that can truly destroy you, they don't kick down your door. They don't smash your windows. They come in through the front gate. They smile. They bring a bottle of wine to your dinner party. They charm your wife and mentor your son. They carry a copy of Moby Dick, and in those moments you can't rely on the police or the government or anyone else. You have to rely on that little voice in the back of your head, that primal instinct that tells you something is fundamentally wrong. You have to be willing to become your own protector, your own shield. You have to be willing to tear down the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself and face the ugly truth. Because sometimes, the only way to protect the life you've built is to be willing to burn someone else's to the ground. So that's my story. It's not one I tell at dinner parties, but I wanted to share it with you. What do you think? Did I go too far? What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have called the authorities and risked your son becoming a pawn in a much bigger game? Or would you have taken matters into your own hands, like I did? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to trust your gut when everyone else told you that you were wrong, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I have more stories to tell. Stories about what happens when the ordinary world collides with the one that lives in the shadows. Thanks for listening.